Have you ever booked a hotel room that didn't live up to the pictures online? You thought you were getting a tub, and instead you get a step-in shower? And not even the nice kind with an overhead shower head and spa-quality products. Like one with plastic walls with someone's hair still stuck to it. Or where the bedspread makes noise every time you move because it's basically made out of plastic. Where instead of the promised scenic view, your window looks out at a window of an apartment in the building next door where an exhibitionist just happens to live. Turns out, you might want to consider yourself lucky after a night in a place like that, if you manage to make it out alive. Welcome to Strange and Unexplained with me, Daisy Egan. I love a night away at a nice hotel as much as the next guy, and it takes a lot for me to complain. Or worse, take to the internet to complain. I once spent the night in a Motel 6 that was so disgusting I couldn't even make it through the night. But did I bother leaving a review? No, because staying at a Motel 6 was on me. If you expect anything other than a filthy nightmare where someone almost certainly died in the room very recently, that's a you problem. My 1-star review isn't going to make a difference. But, at the very least, I do expect to not be murdered. And I definitely expect to not be murdered by the hotel owner. If I'm not going to make it through a night, I want it to be because I decided to leave. Not because I was chased down hallways that led nowhere, to doors that opened on brick walls, and ultimately to a pit filled with lye in the basement. You know what I mean? If that were to happen to me, I would be leaving a very strongly worded review, for sure. Of course, the people who checked into HH Holmes' murder hotel wouldn't have been able to leave a nasty Yelp review, not only because the internet didn't exist in the mid-1800s, but because they never checked out. Chicago in the 1890s was a hoppin' place to be. City planners had done a bang-up job of rebuilding after the Great Fire of October 1871. The announcement that their fair city would be home to the World's Fair in 1893 brought the promise of jobs and tourism dollars, and with it, more and more people calling Chicago home. One such transplant was Herman Webster Mudgett, who arrived in Chicago in 1886. Mudgett was born in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, to a wealthy family who'd been in New England just about as long as white people had been in New England. Like many boys in the area, Mudgett attended Phillips Exeter Academy and then Gilmanton Academy. According to Eric Larson's book, Devil in the White City, Mudgett's alcoholic father was abusive, and school offered no safe haven, with classmates who bullied him basically for being a nerd. One well-known incident of bullying came when his classmates forced him to put the hands of the classroom's human skeleton on his face in an effort to frighten him. Joke was on his classmates, though, when the incident had the opposite effect. Instead of scaring him, the skeleton's intimate petting helped Mudgett get over his fear of death. And not long after that, Mudgett was killing and dissecting animals. For educational purposes, obviously. Mudgett's nerdery paid off, and he graduated Gilmanton Academy at 16 in 1877 or 78 and took a job as a teacher in Alton, New Hampshire, where his students must have been like, "Who is this Doogie Howser-looking motherfucker?" While there, Mudgett met Clara Loverling. The young couple eloped and were married by a justice of the peace on July 4th, 1878. However, their passion quickly wore off. This might be because he'd been pressuring her into sex since before they'd married, and it just took her a proverbial minute to be like, fuck this shit. The two teenagers still lived with their own parents, even after Clara gave birth to their son, Robert Mudgett. Herman was working for his father-in-law at his grocery, but still didn't earn enough to support a family. So Clara and their newborn lived with her parents while Mudgett remained with his family. And soon, Mudgett began to spend long periods away from home. First just a few days, then weeks, then one day somewhere between 1878 and 1881, he went out for a pack of smokes, as it were, and never came home. I doubt this was any real love lost for Clara, but it might have been nice if he'd notified her or, filed for divorce. At 19, Mudgett left teaching and went off to the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, one of the leading scientific medical schools, especially known for their emphasis on dissection. While he was there, he allegedly helped one of his professors steal dead bodies from graveyards to use in the instruction of anatomy and medicine. And while this is definitely a macabre detail, if true, it wasn't uncommon back then. Most people were not inclined to donate their bodies to science for fear that when the rapture came, they wouldn't have their intact body in order to go to heaven. Don't pull too hard at the thread of logic in that. They sure didn't. Robbing graves, I suppose, doesn't pay the bills, and in 1884, Mudgett moved to Moores Fork, New York, where he established a practice in general medicine. But apparently that wasn't paying the bills either, because, as he would later write in his memoir,
"Here I stayed for 1 year doing good and conscientious work, for which I received plenty of gratitude, but little or no money. And in the fall of 1885, starvation was staring me in the face, and finally I was forced to sell first one and then the last of my 2 horses."
And so Mudgett did what any reasonable man might do when faced with financial hardship. He plotted insurance fraud. Some years back, Mudgett and a classmate had had a casual chat about how easy it would be to buy life insurance on one of them, make the other the beneficiary, and then use a cadaver to fake the death of the insured one. Those grave robbing days would pay off after all. When the beneficiary collected the insurance money, they'd split the take. It was a foolproof plan. Mudgett looked up his old friend, who it just so happened was as bad off as he was, and the two devised a plan which went a little something like this. Mudgett knew a guy whom we'll call Bob, who had an impressive life insurance policy of $40,000, more than $3 million in today money. In a drunken rage, Bob would kill his wife and child. In reality, Bob's wife and child would go to the West Coast and wait for Bob to kill himself and join them. When police would find Bob's badly decomposed body, they would find a confession tucked away in his pocket. According to this confession, after killing his wife and child in a drunken rage, he then dismembered them, preserving the remains by placing them in a strong brine and shipping them to separate and distant warehouses to hide the evidence. The confession would end with his intent to die by suicide, but not before saying that any insurance money should only go to the specific relative he designated in the letter. When the relative, presumably Mudgett, collected the insurance, all 3 men would split the payout. This unnecessarily complicated plan included the procurement of 3 cadavers, as well as the preserving fluid and vessels in which the dismembered cadaver parts would be shipped away. But not to worry, all their costs would be recouped with all that insurance money. Why on earth they thought they would have to actually ship severed body parts all over the place instead of just alluding to it in the confession and sending police on a wild goose chase to find them, I don't know. Maybe they figured it would lend some believability to a preposterous story? But alas, Herman read 2 stories of insurance fraud being discovered and realized how well organized and how well prepared the insurance companies were to figure out and prosecute these crimes. And then his old college friend suddenly died, and with him, so died their plan. Without this money-making scheme, Mudgett tried to find work in a pharmacy, but ended up taking a job as the caretaker at the Norristown Asylum in Philadelphia. In his memoir, he wrote this about that time.
"This was my first experience with insane persons, and so terrible was it that for years afterwards, even now sometimes, I see their faces in my sleep."
The asylum was so terrible, apparently, that Mudgett quit after only a few days. After the asylum, Mudgett managed to get work at a pharmacy, but fled after poisoning a child to death. Whether or not the poisoning was intentional, we don't know. He did not have a degree in pharmacology. For reasons unknown to me, Mudgett chose Chicago as his next stomping ground. The Windy City, and indeed the world, would be forever changed upon his arrival. Strangers, have you gotten your Miracle-Made space-age sheets yet? Summer is coming, and with it, more sweating. But with Miracle-Made sheets and their silver-infused fabric inspired by NASA technology, I stay nice and dry and therefore wake up much happier. Of course, then I spend a couple of hours awake and I'm miserable again because of the horrors. If only Miracle Maid had a solution for the horrors. Though I suppose not having to do as much laundry helps counteract some of the horrors. Listen, sweating like an Austrian bodybuilder while you're in the gym is one thing, but doing it at night in your bed is a whole other ball of wet sheets. It's not just uncomfortable, it's stinky and gross. And then you have to spend more time doing laundry and less time going out there and taking down Kuato. I have no idea why I'm on an Arnold Schwarzenegger kick today. Maybe it's because I got such a good night's sleep and I'm just in a silly mood. And it's early enough in the day that the horrors haven't sent me back to bed with my luxurious yet affordable Miracle Maid bedding. Go to trymiracle.com/strange to try Miracle Maid sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo code STRANGE at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Maid. Go to trymiracle.com/strange and use the code STRANGE to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/strange to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Maid, for sponsoring this episode. In 1886, Herman Webster Mudgett arrived in Chicago and fatefully chose the name Henry Howard Holmes. I don't know why he chose that name, but I do know I, too, would change my name if it was Herman Mudgett. According to an article by Deborah Pollock for Mediadrome, Mudgett happened upon a pharmacy at the corner of Wallace and 63rd Street in Englewood, Illinois. Dr. E.S. Holton, the pharmacist and proprietor, was suffering with a terminal cancer diagnosis while his wife, Elizabeth, tried to keep the store going. Mudgett introduced himself as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes and asked if they needed a pharmacy assistant. Elizabeth Holton hired him on the spot. With the charming and handsome Holmes helming the pharmacy counter, business was booming, and when Mr. Holton succumbed to his cancer later that same year, an overwhelmed and grieving Mrs. Holton gave Holmes more and more responsibilities. By the end of that summer, Holmes made an offer to buy the pharmacy. Mrs. Holton agreed on one condition, that she be allowed to continue living in the apartment above the business. Holmes readily agreed, which was, I imagine, a welcome relief to the widow who would now have a place to live and a nice nest egg. Holmes never paid her. So, Mrs. Holton hired a lawyer, but before any legal action could be taken against Holmes, Mrs. Elizabeth Holton disappeared. If anyone asked the new owner of Holton Drugs where the previous proprietor was, he told them that living above the store she no longer owned and without her husband was too depressing, and so she moved to California, which was almost certainly not true. And now Holmes had an empty apartment right above his place of business, ready for him to move into. Later that same year, Mudgett Holmes married Myrta Z. Belknap and hired her at the pharmacy. And in case you're impressed that Myrta was open-minded enough to marry a man who was definitely still legally married to his first wife with a kid, don't be. Holmes definitely omitted that information. She wouldn't have approved of their illegal marriage, and she didn't approve of his wandering eye. According to Eric Larson, Myrta endured Holmes' wandering eye and likely penis for a couple years, until in 1888, pregnant with his child, she abandoned him and Chicago for her parents' home in Wilmette, Illinois, where she gave birth to their daughter, Lucy. From a distance, Holmes acted like a doting father, because anyone can be a doting parent from a distance, though it seems he didn't put in this kind of effort with his first child he'd abandoned, sending his wife and daughter money and toys. Perhaps Holmes was motivated by a sense of love. More likely, though, he was motivated by Myrta's rich uncle's bank account. Holmes began leaning on this uncle for money that he told him would be going to Myrta and Lucy. With this money and the profits from Holton Pharmacy, Holmes bought an empty lot across the street in the summer of 1888. According to his memoir, Holmes wanted his new building to blend in with the neighborhood. It was originally planned to be a 2-story building with retail space on the first floor and residential spaces on the second. But with the World's Fair on its way, Holmes planned a third floor with hotel rooms for the fair's visitors. Holmes' new building took up an entire city block and had more than 100 rooms. The retail spaces on the first floor included Holmes' new pharmacy, the front desk of the hotel, a restaurant, and a jewelry store that he added in 1890. That year, Holmes hired a man named Ned Connor to run the jewelry store, providing Ned and his wife and child an apartment in one of the rooms above. But Ned quit soon after learning about the affair his wife Julia was having with his employer. And then, in a baffling move, Ned moved away, leaving not just Julia, but their 5-year-old daughter, Pearl, behind. After Christmas of 1891, people noticed that Julia and Pearl were suddenly gone. At first, Holmes was like, oh yeah, Julia had to leave unexpectedly to visit her dying sister? Then the story changed to Julia had realized the error of her ways and had left to find Ned and reunite their family. But then the story became that Julia died during an illegal abortion. This story is particularly strange when you take into account that he was, presumably, the father of said aborted child. Why would he admit to procuring an illegal abortion for his own unborn child? One can only assume he was trying to distance himself from the pregnancy by implying she got pregnant by yet another man. Julia and Pearl are considered Holmes' first official victims, which would mean that poor Mrs. Elizabeth Horton really did leave town for California, which, again, she most likely did not. But the thing is, people who kill animals when they're young, continuously commit fraud, and then murder 2 innocent people are probably not going to be like, well, I'd say that's enough murder for my blood. No, indeed, most of these jabronis, once they've started killing, won't stop until they're caught or killed. So, Holmes, now with a jonesing for murder, had to find more victims. And while this guy was an absolute tool, to say the least, he was nonetheless a smart tool. He knew that he couldn't just murder people willy-nilly. He knew that, for example, most of the people who might check into his new hotel would have pesky loved ones poking around if they happened to turn up missing. So, like scores before and after him, Holmes preyed on one of the most vulnerable populations. Young, single women, fresh off the train from their small towns, in search of better opportunities in the big city. Holmes would hang out where these unsuspecting young women might be and offer them a job. He would then hand them an insurance application, assuring them it was all a normal part of the job application. He was investing in them, he would explain. Since they lacked retail experience, he was going to be spending his own time and money teaching them how to be sales clerks. It only made sense, he told them, that he insure his investment. Assured and insured, the young women filled out the paperwork, making Holmes their beneficiary. Jacqueline Anglis, for all that's interesting, writes that he hired as many as 150 women this way. When young women seemed to disappear so quickly after being hired by Holmes, he'd simply explain that many of his new employees just couldn't hack it in the big city and decided to return home to the slow and steady life of the farm. Of course, neighbors would be surprised years later, after his arrest, when the horrific secrets of his building came to light. Strangers, my financial situation changed recently, and I'm looking for ways to cut back on things I don't need. Subscriptions to certain newspapers whose coverage is worryingly pro-fascist? Canceled. Do I really need all the streaming services? No. That teleprompter app that I was using for auditions? What auditions? Am I right? Rocket Money helps me keep track of my subscriptions, cancels the ones I don't need, because honestly, who has the time, and negotiates with others for lower prices. Did you know that most people think they're only spending around $60 a month on subscriptions when they're actually spending closer to $300? Also, more people than you would think have double subscriptions. I know it seems like something you would never do, but Trust me, you might. What's the harm in checking? Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's features. The Rocket Money dashboard shows me my spending month to month so I can clearly see my spending habits. That way I can tell if I can afford the subscription my son wants for some fakakta anime channel. What is even happening? Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/unexplained. That's rocketmoney.com/unexplained. rocketmoney.com/unexplained. In the spring of 1892, Holmes hired a 23-year-old woman named Emmeline Cigrand. Emmeline worked for Holmes for 6 months as a secretary and likely began a sexual relationship with him. You think your picker's broken? Just imagine finding out your boyfriend was this fucking guy. Of course, Emmeline wouldn't have the benefit of finding out anything about Holmes until it was too late. Like Julia and Pearl, Emmeline was last seen just before Christmas, 1892. When Emmeline's parents wrote to ask what became of their daughter, Holmes told them she'd left him for another man. Later, police would come to believe Emmeline was the victim of not just a botched abortion, but a botched abortion performed by Holmes himself. Emmeline's skeleton was eventually found in the home of a doctor who admitted to articulating 3 skeletons for Holmes. Articulating skeletons, for those of you who have preferred to live life without having known this kind of awful stuff before this moment, means putting the bones back together for display. Many people believe Holmes met his next victim, Wilhelmina Minnie Williams, on New Year's Day, 1893, when he happened to visit the office where she worked. Born in Mississippi in 1868, Minnie had a rather tragic childhood before finding herself working at an employment agency in Chicago. The bad luck seemed to continue in adulthood. After meeting Minnie, Holmes, going by the alias Harry Gordon, learned that Minnie had just lost her brother in a mining accident and was set to inherit a large sum of money and a property near Fort Worth, Texas. Somehow, Holmes convinced Minnie to move with him to Chicago's Lincoln Park, where they were soon joined by Minnie's sister Anna, who went by the name Nanny. I think it's safe to say at this point that what Holmes lacked in basic humanity, he more than made up for in charm and persuasion. In a letter reprinted in author and historian Adam Seltzer's book, HH Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, Nanny, only 18, wrote to an aunt in July 1893 saying Brother Harry was taking them on an adventure to Europe. Holmes, she wrote,
says you need never trouble any more about me, financially or otherwise. He and sister will see to me. I hope our hard days are over.
Nanny disappeared first, last seen on July 4th, 1893, with Minnie last seen the following day. Turns out, murdering and frauding is too much for one man to handle alone, and by the time Minnie and Nanny disappeared, Holmes had hired himself a right-hand man to help manage all the various murders and fraud. Benjamin Peitzel, a man who had spent time in prison in his past, was working as a carpenter when the two men met in November 1889. Holmes hired Peitzel initially to take care of some workhorses, but before long, Peitzel became Holmes' all-around assistant. In his book Devil in the White City, Eric Larson points out the two men must have had a close relationship, or close enough that Holmes did Peitzel a costly favor, posting bail for him in a case of check fraud. On August 13, 1893, the third floor of Holmes' custom-built pharmacy/apartment building/hotel caught fire. And by caught fire, I mean Holmes almost definitely set fire to it. But the conflagration was slow enough that everyone was able to get out in plenty of time. Still, the building itself was almost entirely destroyed. Problems arose when Holmes attempted to file claims on the insurance policies he had taken out on the building, with at least 4 different companies. Upon realizing they'd been had, the companies sued him rather than issuing any payouts. Now, under serious investigation for insurance fraud, Holmes fled the Windy City in the summer of 1894. He reappeared in Fort Worth, Texas, hoping he would be able to reestablish himself, castle and all, on the property given to him by Minnie Williams. But Holmes just couldn't leave well enough alone and got himself arrested for selling stolen goods in St. Louis, resulting in his first stint in jail. There, he met Marion Hedgepath, a man serving a 25-year sentence who figured he had nothing to lose. So when Holmes approached him with one of his harebrained insurance schemes, Hedgepath was all in. Holmes told Hedgepath his plan to commit yet another insurance fraud, this time for $10,000, more than $320,000 in today money, by taking out a policy on himself and then faking his death. What he needed, he told Hedgepath, was the name of a lawyer he could trust. So Hedgepath provided the name of a crooked lawyer for the promise of a $500 payout. But the insurance company was getting pretty suspicious of Holmes and refused to issue the policy. He didn't press the matter, instead deciding to put that energy into a new plan. If the insurance company wouldn't let him open a new policy, surely they would let Benjamin Peitzel open one. So, Holmes convinced Peitzel to fake his own death as a way of providing for his family. The $10,000 payout would go a long way to support Peitzel's wife and 5 children. Knowing insurance companies in Chicago were catching wise to Holmes' schemes, this plot would take place in Philadelphia, where Peitzel established himself as an inventor named B.F. Perry. Soon after moving to Philly, there was to be an explosion in his lab, and the unfortunate cadaver found to play Peitzel would be so badly burned, no one, not even his wife, Carrie Alice, who was in on the whole scheme, would be able to identify it. All was planned to perfection, Peitzel surely thought, and it was, just not the way Peitzel had thought. In B.F. Perry's lab, Holmes knocked Peitzel out with chloroform and then set his right-hand man's body on fire. Insurance payout in hand, Holmes went back to convince Peitzel's wife that the plan had gone off without a hitch. He told her that Peitzel was in London, just waiting for his family to join him. But, Holmes cautioned, the insurance company would be watching the family closely, looking for anything suspicious. So, Holmes reasoned, why didn't he take the 3 middle children with him? No one would be looking for a single man with 3 children, nor would they find a widow with 2 children suspicious. Remarkably, Peitzel's wife agreed to let this random dude take 3 of her children. Holmes brought 13-year-old Alice and 9-year-old Nellie to Toronto and left them there while he took the other Peitzel child in his custody, 10-year-old Howard, to the Irvington suburb of Indianapolis. Under what premise, I have no idea. While there, Holmes visited a local pharmacy to get the drugs he needed to kill Howard, which he did on October 10th. Who knows what he told Howard's sisters when he got back to Toronto, utterly Howardless. Holmes murdered Alice and Nellie on October 25, 1894, by forcing them into a large trunk and locking it. After securing them inside, he drilled a hole into the lid, slid a hose through the hole, attached the other end of the hose to a gas line, and asphyxiated the girls. Herman Webster Mudgett, come HH Holmes, was finally arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894, mere weeks after murdering the Peitzel children. But it wasn't the murders that Holmes was arrested for. He was arrested for horse theft. Apparently, in the middle of all the murdering and frauding, Holmes had managed to also steal some horses. Listen, stealing horses in the middle of a murder spree is the very definition of looking a gift horse in the mouth. Stop while you're ahead, buddy. Detectives were aided by a tip from Holmes' former cellmate, Marion Hedgepath, who was apparently pissed that he'd never received any money from his buddy's plans to defraud insurance companies. Don't fuck over fellow inmates. By the following summer, 1895, the bodies of many of his victims had been discovered, including the partial remains of Julia and Pearl Connor, in the basement of his huge building in Chicago. While there were plenty of clues in Chicago to issue a warrant for his arrest, the city of Philadelphia had the clearest and cleanest case for murder against Holmes, namely the murder of his former employee, Benjamin Peitzel, and I will not comment on the fact that it just so happened to be a man whose murder brought Holmes down, never mind all the women he'd apparently murdered. Holmes' trial for the murder of Benjamin Peitzel began in October of 1895. At the beginning of his time in custody, Holmes swore all he'd done during his life of crime was commit insurance fraud. But by the time a guilty verdict was all but certain, his story changed dramatically. Once his fate was sealed, Holmes really leaned into the stories being written about him, sensationalizing himself and his story even more. Parts of his confession appeared in newspapers around the world, like London's Reynolds newspaper.
I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world. He has been with me since. The inclination to murder came to me as naturally as the inspiration to do right comes to the majority of persons. Where others' hearts were touched with pity, mine filled with cruelty. Sought devices strange, fantastical, and even grotesque. It pleased my fancy. It gave me play to work my murderous will, and I reveled in it with the enthusiasm of an alchemist on the trail of the philosopher's stone.
These made for fantastical news accounts, but also made it impossible for police to determine precisely what was true and what was Holmes' fantasies. Holmes now claimed he'd killed over 200 people. And it was these fantasies, reprinted and likely further filled out by the imaginations of the pressmen of the day, that helped create the lasting cult of personality that is HH Holmes and his so-called murder castle. For example, according to an article from the Chicago Tribune published around the time of the trial, the second floor of Holmes' Chicago mansion, listed as residential space on the original plans, held the true horror chambers of the murder castle. Beginning at the south end of the second floor, the article says, quote, is a space, neither a hall nor a room, through which a person can wander several different ways on account of the irregular wall. In fact, there seems to be little else but walls in the area. End quote. In the middle of the second floor, there were a set of mysterious small rooms which could only be accessed through a dark closet. Inside the closet were 4 doors. One opened into what appeared to be another closet. Another door opened into what was called a sealed chamber. Allegedly, when the building was first searched, after the fire that nearly destroyed much of it, the door was boarded up, and an experienced eye was needed to detect a doorway there at all. 2 Chicago detectives knocked the boarded-up entrance down to find a chamber, entirely in the dark, and with only one entrance, the one they'd just reopened. This secret chamber, the Tribune piece continued, was one of the largest rooms in the house, 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. There was no furniture in the room, and judging by the stifling air, no ventilation either. A drawing based on alleged witness statements included rooms labeled as waiting room, reception room, dark room, secret hiding place, sealed room, blind room, chute from room to basement, bathroom with hidden stairs to basement, trapdoor from 3rd floor, the hanging secret chamber, the maze, laboratories, and asphyxiation chamber. Some rooms had 5 doors and others had none. Airless, coffin-like rooms were found built under the floors of many rooms, and most rooms had been lined with iron plating as a way of soundproofing them. If you had the unfortunate experience of going to Holmes' basement, you would find yet another chamber of horrors. According to the Crime Museum, once remains were sent down the aforementioned chute, they reached a special laboratory. Within its walls was a dissecting table, a stretching rack, a lye pit, and a crematorium. Once Holmes sent his victims down the chute, he dissected them, removing the flesh, and sold the skeletons as models to medical schools. If it was too dangerous to go that route, he would put the remains in the crematorium or into the lye pit to destroy them. But how, you might ask yourself, and I certainly have, could one person, or anyone really, have built something like this in the middle of one of the busiest cities in the country, bustling with millions of people? It turns out much of the information we have about the how of it all comes from contemporary news accounts of the day. According to HH Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, author Adam Seltzer explains Holmes used multiple architects and subcontractors. Whenever one was getting close enough to finishing one of his special rooms, Holmes would fire them or simply never pay the bill. By the time of his arrest, Holmes was involved in many lawsuits. Contractors with unpaid bills, liens against his property, and various mortgages on the building that were several pages long. One famous story included Holmes buying a large room safe on credit for which he never made any payments, a favorite tactic of his. When the company came to repossess the safe, Holmes had renovated the entrance to the safe room, narrowing it so it was now too small to remove the safe without tearing out the walls. A surviving former employee remembered Holmes asking him to step inside another safe on the first floor. Seriously, how big were these safes? After the employee stepped inside and Holmes closed the door, the employee was to scream to test just how soundproof the safe actually was. Hearing only the faintest sound of his employee's voice, Holmes let him out, muttering how he wished he could have put his mother-in-law in there. But here's where I throw a potentially wet blanket over this whole schmageggy. I have to admit, I have never actually been very interested in covering this story, and I couldn't tell you why. Until now. This all seemed too preposterous to be true. And honestly, the how, what, where of the house itself seems to overshadow the actual murders of real people, and you know me, stranger, I generally think dead people deserve more respect and reverence than, say, an alleged real-life escape room. The so-called witness accounts that historians and authors have used for over a century to retell this story come mostly from tabloid papers and pulp books. Author Adam Seltzer, whose book H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, is considered a solid source for this whole mishegas, and told the History Channel in 2023 that he himself is guilty of being drawn in by those stories and now realizes most of them were highly exaggerated, to say the least, in order to sell papers. One such book, he tells the History Channel, from 1940 called Gem of the Prairie by Herbert Ashbery, quote, had kind of a throwaway line that some people suggested it may have been as many as 200 people. Nobody had actually suggested that, in fact, but thereafter, everybody else who retold the story threw in that same line until people started deciding that that was the real estimate or a real possibility, end quote. The History Channel website goes on to explain, quote, there's also no evidence Holmes trapped strangers inside his hotel in an attempt to kill them. The 9 people he likely killed were all people he already knew, and the building he owned wasn't a hotel. The first floor consisted of storefronts, and the second floor had apartments for long-term rental. Without any evidence, newspapers claimed Holmes used his building chutes to transport bodies to the basement. The fact that he had a chute was not unusual, since many buildings had laundry chutes connected to the basement. These stories turned Holmes' building into an elaborate torture dungeon outfitted with gas pipes to asphyxiate victims and soundproof rooms to hide their screams, end quote. Seltzer explained, quote, there's a total of about 9 people that we can say with some confidence he probably killed. Confessed to 27 at one point, but several of them were still alive at the time, end quote. And author Harold Schechter told the History Channel, quote, it's my belief that probably all those stories about all these visitors to the World's Fair who were murdered in his quote-unquote castle were just complete sensationalistic fabrication by the yellow press, end quote. Regardless if the total body count was 9, 27, or 200, and regardless of whether he built an IRL escape room of death, Herman Webster Mudgett sucked. Big time. Just like a real shitty dude. And following in the tradition of shitty dudes everywhere, Mudgett/Holmes chose to represent himself in his trial. And so, Mudgett was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, a conviction he appealed and lost. He hoped his execution would be delayed by additional trials in both Canada and Illinois, but Pennsylvania did not want to lose their chance to execute such a famous criminal. He was hanged by the neck until dead on May 7, 1896, at 10:12 a.m. at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. Good riddance. On the bright side, though, the execution was not properly planned. His neck didn't break. Instead, Mudgett was strangled to death. Though he twitched for 10 full minutes before dying, the prison doctor claimed he didn't suffer. And I don't know about you, stranger, but I sure like to think he did suffer. Hopefully, Herman Webster Mudgett felt every single one of those 10 excruciating minutes before he finally departed for that escape room/torture chamber called hell. Thanks for joining me for Strange and Unexplained. Strange and Unexplained is a production of Three Goose Entertainment and Grab Bag Collab. Today's episode was written by me, with writing help and research by Jen Erdman, audio engineering by Amanda Rossman. Our voice actors for today's episode were David Wald and Angie Chapman. For early, ad-free episodes of Strange and Unexplained, check us out at patreon.com/grabbagcollab. $8 gets you early ad-free Strange and early ad-free Crimes of the Centuries from Amber Hunt. But if you love the ads, you can keep them. And for just $5, you'll get Dear Daisy, a podcast about secrets, The Catalyst, and Shut the F Up, Nick Lachey, with me and Broadway sensation Ellen Marsh. Why, you can find so much content on GrabBag for just $5, you'll think you're shopping at Temu. Check us out on Instagram at SNUPod and GrabBag Collab, and please take a minute to rate and review us on Apple or Spotify. It really helps the show out a lot. And why not visit a sponsor? If you want to suggest a topic for an episode for Strange, go to the website strangeandunexplainedpod.com and fill out the contact form. I promise to write you back, unless you're being an asshole. In which case, you can go check yourself into the HH Holmes Hotel.